Hello, Player One. Welcome to the Gaming History Club. My name is Gabby.
Hello, and I'm JP. Some of you might think bootleg video game consoles are nothing more than cheap knockoffs, shady hardware pretending to be the real deal. But Player One, it's not that simple. Some bootlegs were surprisingly brilliant, and in some parts of the world, they weren't just an option, they were the gateway to gaming. So let's explore the history of bootleg consoles.
So, Player One, first things first, a bit of a disclaimer. We have our dog in the room with us right now. So, if you hear any strange noise during this episode, or some snoring, probably, that's not us, not our neighbor, it's our dog.
Yeah, he is known to snore from time to time and also go like this. Which is not us, because we're professionals, but our dog is less professional. We'll point out when he's doing it, Player One, so you can get familiar with our dog's noises, his strange noises. He's a bit grumpy today, so we decided we should join him into the podcasting room today.
Wait, we're joining him to the podcasting room?
Yeah, we're joining him here. He's allowed to be here as much as we are, okay?
Yeah, we're letting him be here in the recording room with us basically today. But yeah, anyway, we're not here to talk about our dog, although he's like really adorable and all that, but that's another episode probably.
It's another podcast, maybe.
Okay, yeah, it's not Gaming History Club. But we're gonna talk about the history of bootleg consoles. So JP, have you ever had any bootleg consoles before?
No, I mean, I must have seen some when, back then in the day when I lived in Spain, there was a lot of flea markets. I'm sure I would have seen some bootleg consoles, but I was always a very, up to speed child on the latest gaming news. So
Privileged, you mean? Huh?
yes, very privileged. So I could easily tell all these fakes apart from the real deal. But I did have some, fake stuff sometimes. I do remember that when I was without MP3 player, my mom came home with like this iPod, right? And it looked exactly like an iPod, but it wasn't an iPod. And the biggest giveaway was, do you remember that like circular disc at the front where you can rotate your thumb around it to go up and down? Well, it had that, but it didn't have the rolling thing. Like you had to press up, up, down, down across the menu. Yeah,
okay.
That was the biggest giveaway. This was a fake. But I didn't have an MP3 player anyway. I wasn't fussy that this was a fake. I was just happy to have an MP3 player. And maybe other people couldn't make fun of me. I didn't have an iPod because they thought I had an iPod when it really wasn't. So
fair enough, until someone plays with it and then you're like, oh yeah, that is probably not real. But you know what? Who cares, right? It still plays music.
yeah, you haven't had any experience with, pretend video game consoles either, have you?
No, not really. But yeah, I've seen some, but never actually own one. And yeah, I think it's really important before we talk about all this to define them. What exactly are bootleg consoles anyway? Because I feel like the term bootleg consoles, console clones, and knockoffs kind of get tossed around like they're all the same thing, but they're all actually quite different, especially if you see it from legality point of view, hardware design, and the intended use of it. So in this episode, we're going to try to untangle all of these terms and explore this fascinating world of, let's say, not quite original gaming machines, basically.
Yes, or unauthorized is another good word to
Yes.
lump all of these categories into one thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. But with that said, real world examples sometimes, blur the lines. Plenty of consoles don't really sit neatly into one box, which is why these terms end up used interchangeably by collectors, gamers, and probably confused relatives buying Christmas gifts because they can't really tell the difference. I don't blame them.
Yes, but Player One, before we go any deeper, let me just say that if you do end up building your own console that can run PS5 games, don't use our podcast as legal advice.
Yeah, please don't.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start with bootleg consoles, since, well, we've actually named the episode after them, and most of our focus in this episode will be on bootleg consoles. So let's have a look. The main characteristic of a bootleg console is kind of straightforward, to be honest. It's simply a gaming device made by a third party that illegally runs pirated video games from another company, and very often without permission and most always without shame.
Yes, so you can think of it like this: you build your own console that can run copied Nintendo games, then sell that console to other people. So that's basically the bootleg business model. The way these machines actually run those games has changed over time, to be honest. So some of them run official cartridges or discs directly, but others use copied versions of those cartridges or discs that I mentioned.
Yeah, but most commonly nowadays, they just come pre installed with pirated games already. So you plug in the console, you power it up, and you've got 1000 classic titles at your fingertips. Sometimes allegedly, though. So you've probably seen these consoles before yourself, maybe at a flea market, a shady website, or a discount shop. The 1000 NES games in one, but only providing that they're the actual real games and not some bizarre homebrew game knockoffs or hacked versions of Mario where everything is suddenly Sonic, which is foreshadowing the next episode, by the way, a little bit.
Yeah.
These consoles are usually cheap, they're mass produced, and they're sold in bulk. But like I said, what defines them mostly is that they are illegal. They violate trademarks, hardware patents, and copyright protections on the software that they include.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, bootlegs aren't just imitations, but they're full on infringers, basically. So that's quite different to the next one we want to talk about, which is console clones. So, kind of just like bootlegs, console clones are able to play official cartridges or CDs, but the key difference is that they aren't necessarily illegal.
If the original console's hardware patents have expired, it becomes perfectly legal then to design and sell your own machine that can run those original games, as long as you don't include pirated software. So that's kind of the big line in the sand. Console clones don't necessarily run copied games, they run the real deal. You're expected to bring your own real, official licensed cartridges or discs to play in these console clones. And these console clones are still especially popular with retro gamers. And why is that, you might ask? Well, they often come with modern conveniences like save states, for example, brand new, really good gamepads, HDMI outputs, and better video quality than the original hardware.
Yeah, and collectors love them too, right? Because they let you keep your original aging consoles in pristine condition, basically. Well, you can still enjoy the games on something less sacred, I would say.
Yeah, so technically speaking, if you ever wanted to build your very own NES compatible console, you could do that. You could even design your very own NES games to run on that console. Just do not ship your console with a pirated copy of Mario Brothers or Zelda that's already hard coded into the menu, because then we are back to bootlegging and not a console clone.
So, the last one that we want to talk about, the definition is the knockoffs. Possibly when you play this episode, this might be the one that you had in your mind. So, knockoff consoles are designed to trick the casual buyer, whether that's a well meaning parent, a generous grandparent, or an unsuspecting friend who saw something that looked just like a PlayStation, but it only sells for $20. Hmm, suspicious.
Thanks a lot for your $20 PlayStation, Brad.
Yes, Brad, thank you for that.
Yeah, so these machines mimic the physical appearance of modern consoles, and you'll see something that looks like a Nintendo Wii or a PSP or even a PlayStation 5, but with slightly off names like the Police Station instead of PlayStation, or the Nintendo V with two E's instead of I's, or the good old Game Child, which is trying so hard to be a Game Boy. Cue Britney Spears here, by the way. I'm not a game child, not yet a Game Boy.
Okay.
Some of these knockoffs don't even try to run real games, not even pirated ones. Instead, they come loaded with like original, very low effort, bare bones, janky 2D platformers. Or like, races where all you do is like, drive upwards and there's nothing else happening. Repetitive puzzle clones, Yeah, some of them are like just very, very terrible.
Yeah, and it's actually really bad, isn't it? Because the packaging is hyping them up as like, ooh, full ray tracing PS5 level hardware. But actually, when you open it and you switch it on, it's probably closer to calculator with delusions of grandeur.
You know what, Guppy? Luckily, I always made sure to supervise any and all video game related purchases in my family because I was and still am the household expert on the matter. So, this is probably the reason why I didn't have any knockoff consoles.
Yeah, I would actually not be surprised if your mom one day just tell you, JP, I have this like brand new console for you.
Yeah, it only costs $20. And
Not suspicious at all.
it comes with 5,000 games. Your mother is great, isn't she? Huh, JP?
I know, right? But yeah, but now let's dive into the history itself of bootlegging. And yeah, it's been around since the very beginning of video games. I don't think we should be surprised about this, but it is quite surprising when I read about it, to be honest. So, let's start with the Pong clones.
Yeah, well, let's rewind then back to 1972 when Atari released Pong. Within months, the market was flooded with clones, copies, and very questionable lookalikes as well. But the game was such a runaway hit that companies around the world very quickly rushed to make their very own versions. And in fact, when Atari officially launched Pong in Japan a year later, they discovered something quite unexpected. Japan already had its own clones on store shelves. So Sega already had the Pongtron out in Japan. And Taito released Pong already. So bootlegging was already a global phenomenon.
But here where it gets quite controversial, right? Atari's Pong was basically a clone too, in a way. It lifted its core idea from the Magnavox Odyssey's table tennis game. Of course, Atari improved on it, adding sound, scoring system, and smoother control, but that didn't stop Magnavox from suing Atari or, well, pretty much everyone who tried to make a paddle based game after that. I mean, we're quite lucky that they didn't sue, the Wii Tennis or something because they probably would if they could.
Yeah, we're quite lucky they didn't sue us for mentioning Pong way more often than table tennis for the Magnavox Odyssey.
I know.
But you know what? If we really want to open the history box here, Magnavox table tennis itself was also likely inspired by William Higginbotham's Tennis for Two, which ran on an oscilloscope all the way back in 1958. So, yeah, bootlegging and cloning go way back. But let's not disappear into a rabbit hole. We covered all of this in our very first episode 2 years and 1 week ago. So happy birthday to us, by the way.
Oh god, yeah, 2 years already, huh?
And 1 week.
That's been a while. So before we leave the world of Pong clones behind, let's zoom in on one of the most overlooked and possibly most important legacies of bootlegs and console clones. They brought video games to places that were otherwise left out. While the official gaming industry focused on North America, Japan, and Western Europe, it was bootlegs and clones that opened the door to gaming to much of the rest of the world. Countries across Eastern Europe, South America, China, the Middle East, and especially those behind the Iron Curtain.
A real Pong arcade cabinet will have often been way too expensive or restrictive to import into these regions, but the parts needed to make a Pong style machine were relatively cheap, and so manufacturers in places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, they began producing Pong clones by the crate load, and not just for their own markets, but these were made to be sold to Australia, Europe, and beyond.
These weren't just throwaway imitations either, some came packed with multiple variations of Pong, like four player hockey, horizontal pedals, or chaotic new twists on the basic mechanics, so some of them are actually even enhanced. By the late 70s and early 80s, nations like the Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc countries, and China had begun to reverse engineering Pong and creating their own homegrown versions. One example was the Russian Tournier. It was a Pong style home console with four built in game modes. It weighed 2.5 kilograms and cost around 150 rubles. So, roughly around that time is a month's average salary in Russia.
Yeah, that's not cheap, but for families who could manage it, it was a ticket into the digital age and still way cheaper than if they would have bought a real Pong cabinet from America, right? Bootleg consoles like these, they weren't just imitations, they were a gateway to a whole new culture of play. It was a real big deal for the Russians.
And as we move into the 1980s and the rise of the 8-bit generation, the bootleg and clone console scene exploded. And right at the center of it all was the most bootlegged and cloned console of all time, Nintendo's Famicom and the NES.
No other console, before or since, has been replicated in so many forms, so many shapes, under so many names, and sold to so many people across the globe than the Famiclones. In regions like Asia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, South America, parts of Africa, official NES consoles were often way too expensive, especially with the massive import fees, political restrictions, or just general economic hardships that many places around the globe were and are still in.
Yeah, so for families in those regions, official consoles from Atari, Nintendo, or Sega were often a luxury item reserved for the wealthy or middle class. The rest had to make do with what was available, and what was available was often a Famiclone. You see? Famicom clone, Famiclone. Quite smart name, actually.
It's better than NES clone, I suppose.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's true.
These were consoles that mimicked the Famicom NES hardware, and sometimes super accurately, and they could play real NES cartridges or hacked versions of them. Most were made without Nintendo's permission, and depending on the local laws, they existed in a grey or just completely illegal zone.
No one really knows the exact number, but it's estimated that over 1,000 or maybe several thousand different Famiclone models have been produced since the late 80s. That's a lot.
Yeah, but some of these were icons in their own right. So the Dendy, that was a Russian Famicom so successful that it basically was the NES in Russia and Belarus. The Pegasus dominated homes in Poland. The Micro Genius, made in Taiwan, was spread throughout the Southeast Asia region and even in parts of the Middle East. And the NASA console, which was a South American staple, often bundled with cartridges that already came with dozens of games packed into one. These weren't just lookalikes. In many places, they were the first and only gateway into gaming for an entire generation.
And by the late 1980s, China was beginning to open up to international markets, but steep customs tariffs made importing official game consoles prohibitively expensive. So, as a result, local Chinese companies began manufacturing their own, often unlicensed, version of popular systems, especially the Famicom. This created a kind of legal gray zone where bootleg hardware and pirated games really thrived, even as they became everyday staples for people in China.
One of the biggest names to come out of this era in China was Subo, whose console was the Xiao Ba Wang, or Little Tyrant, and that became a huge household name in China. These consoles often doubled as educational computers, featuring keyboards and typing games to give them an air of legitimacy. And yes, some were even endorsed by Chucky Chan himself in full 1980s glory.
Yeah, so within just a few years, it's estimated that over 30 million Famiclones were sold in China alone, and many of these were later exported to other countries. But China quickly became this global hub for Famiclones, supplying markets across Latin America, Africa, and also parts of Asia.
And just like the Dendy in Russia or the Pegasus in Poland, these Chinese Famiclones weren't niche imports. They were the console of their generation. Did Chow Chow just bark in his sleep, by the way?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, that's so cute. Anywho, take the family game, for example. This was a family clone distributed by Electrolab in Argentina. At the height of its popularity, the family game is estimated to have captured a whopping 95% of the entire Argentine console market. Can you imagine 95%? And this is a Famiclone, yeah?
Yeah, it was basically like their main console in the country.
Yeah, so without, repeating myself too often, if we can learn anything out of this episode player one, these weren't just bootleg consoles or cheap knockoffs. For many places around the world, it was a console for an entire nation of players, first being introduced to video gaming whatsoever.
Yeah, so still talking about Famiclones, the earliest Famiclones were mostly manufactured in Taiwan and were near identical hardware clones to the original Famicom if you compare it. Many of them used clone chipsets produced by the Taiwanese company called UMC or United Microelectronics Corporations.
Yeah, and one of the major players in this space was Microgenius, and they were a company whose Famiclones were then exported worldwide and often rebranded under different names. So we have a few examples here. So the Taiwanese company UMC, they made a Famiclone with the model IQ501, and this was sold as the Dendy Classic in Russia, the Nichiman in Colombia, and the Samurai Microgenius in India. They also made a model called the IQ 1000, which then became the Speaker or Speecher
Or Spica?
or Spiker IQ 1001 in Indonesia. And this even had a featured built in infrared receiver. So, like a wireless controller for a Famiclone in the late 80s. Respect, right?
Yeah, and another standout one was the IQ 901 that was rebranded in Italy as the Handy System and MAR or MAR game. So that one was a handheld NES compatible system. So that's really ahead of its time, right? Rare early example here of portable Famiclones.
That's crazy. So basically, in parts of Italy, people were playing like Game Boys, but for the NES, basically. They had like an NES Game Boy. It's another good example of how, these weren't always really bad things. These were way ahead of its time consoles, right?
Yeah, some of them are actually impressive. So yeah, props to them.
Since we're talking a little bit about form factors, most Famiclones were designed like traditional consoles. You plug the console into your TV and you play with wired controllers. But some came disguised as home computers as well, complete with keyboards and the basic programming language.
These were often marketed as educational tools as well, so not necessarily just games, especially in countries where PCs were rare or expensive. There were also TV integrated Famiclones, so the entire consoles built into televisions or portable DVD players. So imagine it, you don't really have HDMI, no menu, you just power it on and play Super Mario Brothers straight from your television set. So that's pretty cool too.
I'm kind of jealous. That would have been way better than the TV I had that had a built in VHS player. Like, give me the one with the built in Nintendo, please.
Yeah, but this is like before our time, really.
The Dendy from Russia is a Famiclone worth spotlighting as well. So it really shows just how important these clones were to people in bringing video games to the world. Nintendo never officially sold the NES in Russia or the former Soviet Union. So when the Dendy launched in December of 1992, it quickly became the de facto NES for that entire region, the biggest country on the world.
But there's a bit of a twist on the timing though, because while gamers in the West were moving on to 16 bit systems like the Super Nintendo, Russian kids were just getting their first taste of NES games basically, thanks to Dendy.
By 1994, the Dendy was selling over 100,000 units every month, making about $5 million in profit monthly. It retailed for around 39,000 rubles, which was just under $100 back then. Though technically a clone, the Dendy wasn't some obscure flea market curiosity. It was embraced wholeheartedly.
It even had its own mascot, this cute little elephant. They ran advertising campaigns with it, had dedicated magazines, and even TV shows devoted to it.
Yeah, in fact, Dendy became such a household name, so much so that people would call any gaming console or Famiclone a Dendy, much like how Perhaps your own parents called every single console you ended up owning a Nintendo, even if it was actually an Xbox.
I know, right? I feel like that's a global phenomenon, a little bit, calling everything like the same console. But yeah, eventually the company behind Dendy, Steepler it's called, struck a deal with Nintendo to become the exclusive distributor of the Super Nintendo and Game Boy across all former Soviet states.
They would even be cleared of any legal copyright issues, but under one very Nintendo like condition: do not promote Sega. Yeah, so no Sega allowed.
Wow, okay, so exclusive for real, yeah? So we're entering the mid to late 1990s here, and Famicom started to look very different under the hood. With improving technology, manufacturers began packing the entire NES system into a single tiny chip. So that's known as NES on a chip or NOAC. NOAC? NOAC?
Yes.
NOAC, yeah. Anyway,
Or no AC because it came without air conditioning.
but anyway, this made consoles much cheaper to produce and allowed for much smaller, more creative form factors, including early handheld Famiclones. But of course, there was a trade off. These NOAC based systems were usually less faithful to the original hardware, which caused compatibility issues with certain games.
So around this time, the knockoff culture really started to blossom, and definitely not for the better. So let's take the Super Megason, for example. It looks almost exactly like a Super Nintendo, but surprise, it's not. It only plays NES games. And the sequel to that fake console was the Super Megason 4, which went even further down the silly hole. It looks just like a PlayStation 1, but again, it's just an NES clone under the hood.
I like how the sequel to Super Megason is like Super Megason 4.
Yeah, don't think too hard about it, like, this is all wrong, yeah.
Yeah, something just doesn't feel right. But yeah, with the Super Megason 4, if you were hoping to relive the 32-bit era, actually no, you'd be stuck with the 8-bit library instead. It's a classic knockoff trickery at its finest somehow.
Classic knockoff trickery, that's right. Let's talk about one of the most infamous examples of console knockoffs, the Polystation. This little monstrosity came in multiple flavors, all based on different generations of Sony's PlayStation, and they are equal parts hilarious and heartbreaking as well. The original Polystation, styled after the PlayStation 1, really tried to sell the fantasy. It came in a near identical shell, complete with the flip-up CD tray, but surprise, inside that disc tray, a cartridge slot
Wait, what?
for NES games. So you boot it up and you're greeted by a glorious promise: 1 million games included.
Yeah, but in reality, it's just about six NES games, probably. So each repeated over and over and over again under different titles. So, for example, you got Kung Fu Panda 7, which is basically just Super Mario Brothers. Again.
You know what? I don't think by the mid 90s there was even 1 million video games in total. I highly doubt it.
Yeah, unless you count all the bootleg video games. I don't know.
Anyway, it gets much worse. Enter the Polystation 3, which looked eerily like a real PlayStation 3, right down to the glossy black finish, except it wasn't a video game console at all. This one was actually a cheap LCD handheld with a tiny, tiny, tiny fold out screen. And you remember those terrible Tiger Electronics games with static backgrounds and flickering black, quote unquote sprites? It was one of those, but wrapped in a PS3 costume. May the gaming gods protect any kids who unwrapped one of these thinking they had just scored Sony's next gen
Oh
console.
no. Yeah, they definitely got tricked. Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, you get to just play one. We could spend hours rattling off low effort knockoffs and fake console that broke, our hearts and our parents' wallets. Well, they didn't break the parents' wallets, but, the parents thought they were getting a good deal when really it was just a heartbreak for us. But that's not the point of this episode. But we'll mention just a few to give everyone a good overview of what the lay of the land was.
But now it's time to turn to the next decade, the 2000s. So around this time, some of the original NES patents begin to expire, which meant that for the first time, it actually became legal in some countries to build an authorized console that could run NES games. So technology improved, not just for Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo, but also for the bootleg world. So suddenly we started seeing these handheld LCD consoles with proper screen tech, more memory, and sometimes actually decent design. For example, we had the infamous POP station, which is basically a shameless PSP clone that looked pretty cool until you turn it on and realized it was barely more than a digital calculator that played fake Tetris. So,
Boo.
deceiving.
So another console to highlight is the Power Player Super Joy 3, and I'll explain why in just a moment, but let's have some context first. In December 2004, the FBI searched two kiosks at the Mall of America, which is in Minnesota, and a storage facility in Miami that was linked to this Power Player Super Joy 3. It's a Famiclone that came in the shape of a Nintendo 64 controller. So you had a generic looking gamepad, but the actual console itself was in the shape of this Nintendo 64 controller. So you would plug all of your cables in there, and you could also slot real Famicom cartridges in it. So it looks like a really bad trip somehow. It's very ugly and frankly natural. Like imagine sticking your PlayStation 5 CDs into your DualSense controller. Like what's happening here, right? But similar to other bootleg and console clones, it overpromised on how many games it actually had by just repeating the same 76 titles 1,000 times. Some of these consoles would actually start slowly smoldering, so they were burning without a flame, right? So, yeah, they were actually super dangerous as well. But that's not why I wanted to talk about this console either. The real reason I wanted to mention this console is because, thanks to the FBI raid, we have some information as to how profitable these consoles were to bootleggers. So the consoles were purchased wholesale for around $7 to $9 each. But the price for consumers when they purchased it was anywhere between $30 and $70. That's crazy, right? So you might be like tripling or like, six timing your profits here than what the console is worth, right? Crazy.
Definitely a ripoff.
No, a knockoff, not a ripoff.
Yeah, true. Okay, so let's talk a little about China again. So in the year 2000, China banned the sale of video game consoles, citing concerns about their addictive influence on children. This created a massive underground market, especially in Shenzhen, the heart of China's electronics manufacturing. Sorry if I didn't say that right, by the way. Shenzhen?
I,
Shenzhen?
I heard it as Shenzhen, but like
Shenzhen, yeah?
it's spelled more like Shenzhen, I suppose. And
Yeah,
yeah, so yeah, apologies for bastardizing the name here, guys.
yeah. But anyway, console clones became a way to bypass the ban, and a thriving subculture emerged here, not just for profit, but for preservation, accessibility, and sometimes even innovation.
Yeah, so you might be wondering, how do you get around a video game console ban? Easy, just don't call it a video game console. So during the ban in China, it became common to disguise console clones as educational tools or family computers. The trick is to not make it look like it's just for fun.
Well, actually, it's fair enough, isn't it? Family computer, Famicom.
Oh, I see what you did there.
But yeah, anyway, the bootleggers didn't stop there. Hybrid systems started to pop up as well, so they combined Famiclones with DVD players or TVs and even handheld learning devices. So some of them were so well integrated, they became household staples, just like your TV remote, but with Contra. You can imagine it that way.
Something we'll get more into in our next episode is how they didn't just copy, though, they localized games as well. They were modified to better suit the cultural tastes of China. So you would load up what looked like Super Mario Bros., but boom, Son Goku jumps out of the pipe instead of Mario. And by the way, if you're wondering, yes, I'm very well aware Dragon Ball is a Japanese anime, but they do absolutely love it in China as well. And it was much more according to their tastes than Mario, for example. I mean, after all, Dragon Ball is based on a journey to the West, as Chinese mythology as well. But that and much more will be the subject of our next episode dropping in a couple of weeks. So stay tuned, Player One.
So nowadays, bootlegs are probably more familiar than ever. There's a flood of handhelds on the market, most of them claiming to play not just one retro console, but dozens of them. So many of them run open source emulators tucked into this nostalgic looking shells and packed with ROMs on SD cards. They're all over social media ads as well, usually accompanied by this way too much stock techno music and phrases like 10,000 games in one console or
10,000 games in one.
yeah, that sums it up. Yeah, thank you.
But a word of caution, Player One, for every decent handheld, there's probably around 100 absolute disasters you do not want to spend money on. They're full of poor screens, really bad buttons, laggy emulation, fake specs, and glued on D-pads. Menus in broken English with a game called Super Mario 14 Legend of the Fish.
Wait, what? Mario is a fish?
Yeah, if you're tempted to buy some of these, just please do your research first before you go crazy on these things. The Wild West of bootleg gaming may have changed forms, but it's still very much alive and barely functioning.
You know, Art, about that bad buttons, by the way, that you mentioned, some of them are actually fake buttons that you can't actually press.
Oh, goodness me. Oh, it's okay. We need to stop here. This is too much for me, Gabby.
Yeah, it is pretty bad sometimes.
So with all that, Player One, I hope you enjoyed this episode and perhaps gave you a newfound respect for unauthorized game consoles.
And as usual, new episodes of Gaming History Club are released every other Wednesday, so make sure you subscribe and follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Gaming History Club.
Come back in a couple of weeks, Player One, where we'll continue our bootleg history journey. And next time around, we're exploring the video games. See ya.